September 1593. The Thames is brown and sluggish, thick with the sewage of 250,000 souls. Wherries and barges crowd the waterway so tightly that a person could almost walk from bank to bank without wetting their boots. And through this chaos, past the bristling masts of merchant ships and the looming bulk of the Tower of London, a vessel is approaching that no one on these docks has ever seen before. It is an Irish galley. Long, low, built of oak, with 16 oars per side and a single square sail patched and stiffened by decades of Atlantic salt. Its hull is scarred by storms and by battle. Its crew are not English sailors in doublets and hose. They are Irishmen, weather-beaten, hard-handed, staring at the towers and spires of London with the guarded curiosity of wolves who have wandered into a cathedral. And at the stern of this galley, gripping the tiller as she has gripped it for 50 years, stands a 63-year-old woman. Her face is lined by wind and grief. Her hands are calloused. Her gray hair is cut short, a habit she has kept since childhood. She has sailed for weeks to reach this place. South from Clew Bay, around the storm-lashed headlands of Kerry and Cork, past the old head of Kinsale, where the Atlantic swells break white against the cliffs, through the narrow channel between Ireland and Cornwall, where English warships patrol and every unfamiliar sail draws suspicion. East through the Strait of Dover, where the coast of France is close enough to smell the bread baking in Calais. And then up the Thames, mile after sluggish mile, into the heart of the most powerful empire in Western Europe. She carries no army. She brings no tribute. She has a dagger hidden in her clothes and a list of demands in her head. In a few hours, she will walk into Greenwich Palace and sit across from Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, ruler of England, France, and Ireland. And she will not bow. Her name is Grace O'Malley. In Irish, Granuaile. In legend, Granuaile. She is a pirate, a chieftain, a mother, a widow, a rebel, and, by the reckoning of every English official in Ireland, the most dangerous woman on the Atlantic coast. She has been fighting the English crown for 40 years. She has been imprisoned. She has been robbed of her cattle, her castles, her ships. And now, with her sons in chains and a death sentence hanging over her family, she has done the one thing no Irish lord has ever dared. She has sailed to London to negotiate with the Queen herself. Stay until the end and you will learn 3 things. First, how a girl who cut off her own hair became the commander of a pirate fleet that terrorized the west coast of Ireland for 4 decades. Second, what really happened inside Greenwich Palace when 2 of the most extraordinary women of the 16th century met face to face. The 18 questions that were asked, the dagger that was found, the handkerchief that was burned, and the deal that was struck. And third, the strange coincidence that links their deaths in the same year, and the reason history chose to remember one of them and forget the other for 400 years. Let us start at the beginning. Not in a palace, but on the wild edge of the known world. The west coast of Ireland in the 1530s was not part of any civilized map. English cartographers drew it vaguely, if at all. Beyond the Pale, beyond the walls of Galway, beyond the last outpost of anything the crown could claim to control, lay a world that might as well have been another planet. The Atlantic crashed against cliffs 300 feet high. Rain came sideways, borne on winds that had gathered their fury across 3,000 miles of open ocean. The bogs stretched for miles in every direction, broken only by gray stone walls, the occasional twisted hawthorn tree, and the tower houses perched on headlands like fists raised against the sea. This was Connaught. This was Mayo. And this was the domain of the O'Malley clan. The O'Malleys were not farmers. While most Irish chieftains measured their wealth in cattle and fields, the O'Malleys measured theirs in hulls and harbors. Their motto, carved into the stone of their castles and into the gunwales of their ships, said it plainly: Terra Marique Potens, powerful on land and sea. For generations, stretching back centuries before any English boot touched Irish soil, they had controlled the waters of Clew Bay. And Clew Bay was no ordinary harbor. It was a vast natural amphitheater of water, studded with 365 islands, according to local legend, one for every day of the year. Its channels so tangled with sandbars, hidden rocks, and shifting currents that no outsider could navigate them without a local pilot. And the O'Malleys were not in the habit of providing pilots to strangers. They fished the deep waters off Clare Island for herring and cod. They traded wool, hides, and salted fish with merchants from Scotland, from Spain, from the ports of Brittany and Bordeaux. They taxed every foreign vessel that passed through their waters, a toll they called a license, though the merchants who paid it had other words for it. And when the license was not paid, when a ship tried to slip through Clew Bay without rendering its due, the O'Malley galleys appeared from behind the islands like wolves from tree lines, and they took what they were owed by force. This was not considered piracy by the O'Malleys. It was business. It was tradition. It was the law of the sea as they understood it. And they had been enforcing it for longer than the English had been a nation. Into this world, around 1530, Grace O'Malley was born. The exact date is unknown. The English kept records of rebels and traitors, not of their birth dates. Her father was Owen O'Malley, known as Dubdara, Black Oak, for the color of his hair and perhaps for the strength of his character. He was chieftain of the clan, lord of Clare Island, and master of a fleet of galleys that ranged from the Aran Islands to the coast of Donegal. Her mother was Margaret, daughter of Croher Og O'Malley, and through her, Grace inherited a bloodline that tied her to the sea going back generations beyond counting. Grace grew up not in drawing rooms and not in convents, though she would visit both in her lifetime. She grew up on the decks of ships. She watched her father's crews haul nets heavy with herring in the grey dawn light off Clare Island. She watched them negotiate with Scottish merchants over barrels of Spanish wine in the shelter of Inishbofin. She sat in the stern of her father's galley as it threaded the hidden channels of Clew Bay, and she memorized every rock, every sandbar, every current. The secret map that no cartographer could draw because it existed only in the minds of the O'Malleys. She learned the tides. She learned to read the weather by the color of the sky over Croagh Patrick and by the way the Atlantic swell changed direction before a storm. She learned, before she could read a single word in a book, that the sea was both livelihood and weapon. And then there is the legend, the story that gave her the name by which Ireland still knows her. As a girl, she was perhaps 10 or 11, Grace begged her father to take her on a trading voyage to Spain. Owen refused. The deck of a galley was no place for a girl, he said. Her long hair would catch in the ship's ropes and rigging. It was too dangerous. So Grace did what any person with an iron will and a knife would do. She went away, found a blade, and cut her hair to the scalp. Every strand. When her father saw her standing on the quay, shorn and defiant, he could not refuse. He could only laugh. The sailors, with the black humor of men who live on the ocean, called her Granuaile, Bald Grace. The name stuck for the rest of her life, long after the hair grew back. And it became the foundation of a legend. Because in that single act, a girl choosing the sea over vanity, choosing adventure over expectation, choosing to become something the world had not prepared a place for, you can see the whole woman she would become. By the age of 11, she was sailing regularly with her father's fleet. By 15, she understood trade routes, navigation, the reading of stars, and the art of approaching a merchant vessel from downwind so that it could not flee. She spoke Irish and enough Spanish and English to trade in 3 languages. She knew which harbors were safe, which coastlines were patrolled, and which merchants carried cargoes worth the risk of boarding. And at 16, in 1546, she was married. Not for love, though love may have come later. For politics. Her husband was Donal O'Flaherty, Tanist or heir to the O'Flaherty clan in Connemara, a powerful but reckless man who earned himself the nickname Donal an Chogi, Donal of the battles, though in some tellings he is called Donal the Cock for his arrogance in combat. Together they lived at Bunnawan Castle on the wind-swept Galway coast, a fortress of grey stone perched above a bay so exposed to the Atlantic that the spray reached the battlements in winter storms. Together, they had 3 children, Owen, Maeve, Murrow. But marriage did not tame Grace. If anything, it gave her a second fleet to command. Donal was a fighter, hot-blooded and quick to take offense, the kind of man who would ride into a battle he could not win simply because someone had insulted his honor. Grace was both fighter and strategist. She saw the angles. She fortified their harbors. She expanded their trading network south to the Aran Islands and north along the coast of Connemara. She drilled the crews. She turned what had been a loose collection of fishing boats and war galleys into something approaching a professional navy. And she waited, because she knew that a man like Donal would eventually get himself killed. And when that happened, she needed to be ready. She was right. In 1560 or thereabouts, Donal got himself ambushed and slain by the Joyce clan while out raiding near Loch Corrib. The details are murky, as they often are with 16th century Irish feuds, but the result was clear. Donal was dead. Grace was a widow at 30, with 3 children and a castle that every neighboring clan would now see as easy prey. The Joyces moved first. Thinking a widow would surrender or flee, they advanced on Donal's castle at Loch Corrib, a small but formidable tower house perched on an island in the lake. They expected capitulation. What they got was Grace O'Malley on the battlements, directing the defense with a ferocity that stunned them. She rallied the garrison. She organized the archers. According to some accounts, she melted lead from the castle roof and poured it down on the attackers. The Joyces retreated. And the fortress earned a new name that would endure for centuries. It had been called Cock's Castle after Donal. Now they called it Hin's Castle. And the Hin was far more dangerous than the Cock had ever been. The Battle of Hin's Castle did more than save Grace's life. It made her reputation. Word spread along the coast, from Galway to Sligo, that the O'Flaherty widow was not a woman to be trifled with. She had defended a castle single-handedly, or as good as, while the men who should have fought in her place were dead or scattered. In a world where power was measured by what you could hold by force, Grace had proven that she could hold anything. With Donal gone and her reputation secured, Grace returned to Mayo with her children, her followers, and her ships. She established her primary base on Clare Island, the rocky stronghold at the mouth of Clew Bay, where her galleys could be pulled up on the beach under the shadow of her castle walls. The island was a natural fortress, cliffs on 3 sides, a single harbor approach that could be watched from the tower, and the wild Atlantic all around, providing both protection and escape. From here, she built what can only be described as a maritime empire. Her fleet was the key to everything. At its core were 3 galleys, each one a masterpiece of Irish shipbuilding. These were not the frail curraghs of legend. They were substantial vessels, 40 to 50 feet long, built of oak with iron fastenings, powered by 16 oars per side and a single square sail of heavy linen. Each galley could carry 200 to 300 men in wartime, or a substantial cargo of trade goods in peacetime. They were fast, maneuverable, and designed for the violent waters of the Atlantic coast, where the swells could reach 30 feet and the currents between the islands could pull a lesser vessel to its destruction. Around the galleys gathered a constellation of smaller boats, lighter craft, swift and nimble, perfect for ambush and pursuit, for threading the narrow channels where the larger vessels could not follow. Grace did not wait for ships to come to her. She went out and found them. Her operations were a blend of piracy, trade, and mercenary work that the English found baffling and infuriating in equal measure. She raided merchant vessels, particularly those carrying goods to and from Galway, which was the richest port in the west of Ireland, and which Grace considered to be operating in her waters without permission. She charged tolls on every fishing boat that worked the grounds between Clare Island and the Aran Islands. She hired out her fleet and her fighters to warring Irish chieftains. If you needed a coastal fortress attacked from the sea, or a cargo intercepted, or an enemy's harbor blockaded, you went to Grace O'Malley and you paid her price. She traded with Scotland, exchanging Irish wool and hides for Scottish whiskey and weapons. She traded with Spain, importing wine and iron and exporting salted fish and raw wool. She was, by any honest accounting, a businesswoman as much as a pirate, a CEO of violence and commerce, and a spectacularly successful one. Her wealth grew, her reputation spread. Along the entire west coast, from Galway to Donegal, the name Granuaile was spoken with a mixture of fear and admiration that bordered on reverence. In 1566, she married again. This time, the match was even more calculated. The groom was Richard an Yaran Burke, Iron Richard, so called either for his ironworks or for the iron in his character. And the prize was Rockfleet Castle, a 4-story tower house on the shores of Clew Bay. Rockfleet was a fortress of immense strategic value. It sat at the head of a narrow inlet where the tidal channels made approach by hostile ships nearly suicidal. Whoever held Rockfleet controlled the inner waters of Clew Bay. And whoever controlled the inner waters controlled the trade routes, the fishing grounds, and the military access to an entire stretch of the western seaboard. The marriage was contracted under Brecon Law, the ancient Irish legal system that the English were doing their best to abolish. And under Brecon Law, a marriage could be dissolved by either party after 1 year simply by declaration. Legend says that Grace used this provision with surgical precision. After exactly 1 year of marriage, having installed her own followers in every position of importance within Rockfleet and its surrounding lands, Grace locked herself inside the castle, leaned out a window, and shouted the words that dissolved the union under Irish custom. "Richard Burke, I dismiss you." She kept the castle. She kept the garrison. She kept his fleet. Iron Richard, to his enormous credit, seems to have taken this extraordinary maneuver with remarkable equanimity. Perhaps he recognized a superior strategist when he saw one. They remained allies, and by some accounts, lovers, for the rest of his life. They had one child together, a son, and the circumstances of that son's birth would become one of the most extraordinary legends of all. His name was Tibbet na Long, Tibbet of the Ships, and he earned that name because he was born at sea. According to the story, Grace was aboard her galley, either on a trading voyage or in active pursuit of a prize, when her labor began. She delivered the child below deck while the ship was underway. The very next day, some versions say within hours, the galley was attacked by North African corsairs, Algerian or Turkish pirates who had ventured into the Atlantic in search of prey. Grace's crew began to lose the fight. The captain came below to beg Grace to rally the men. And Grace O'Malley, 1 day after giving birth, wrapped herself in a blanket, climbed on deck, picked up a musket, and fired at the corsairs with such fury that the attack was repelled. Whether this story is literally true, or whether it has been improved by 4 centuries of telling, it captures something essential about the woman. She was unstoppable. She was not going to let a small matter like childbirth interrupt her schedule. And now, Grace O'Malley was at the height of her power. She controlled a network of castles and harbors stretching along the western seaboard, from Achill Island in the north to the Aran Islands in the south. Rockfleet was her stronghold, nearly impregnable. Clare Island was her summer base and her watchtower. She had men, she had ships, she had money, and she had something more valuable than all of them combined. She had the knowledge of every rock, every current, every hidden channel, every tidal pattern along 200 miles of the most treacherous coastline in Europe. That knowledge was her weapon, her shield, and her inheritance. No English captain, however brave, however well armed, could match it. But this is where the story turns dark. Because Grace O'Malley did not operate in a vacuum. While she was building her empire on the Atlantic fringe, the English were building theirs across the whole of Ireland. And eventually, inevitably, these two empires collided. The English conquest of Ireland in the 16th century was not a single invasion. It was a slow, grinding, methodical process of colonization, confiscation, and control that stretched over decades. English governors were sent to each province with armies and instructions. English law, common law, was imposed to replace Brehon law, the ancient Irish system that had governed the island for over 1,000 years. Irish chieftains were forced to submit through a program called Surrender and Regrant. Surrender your lands to the crown, receive them back as an English title, abandon the customs and the language that defined you, and become, in the eyes of London, a civilized subject rather than a Gaelic barbarian. Some chieftains submitted. They calculated the odds, saw the writing on the wall, and bent the knee. Some fought. Grace O'Malley fought. For 40 years, she resisted. She refused to recognize English authority over her waters. She continued to trade, to raid, to charge her tolls, to live by Brehon law, in defiance of common law. She made alliances with other rebel chieftains, sheltered fugitives from English justice, attacked English supply ships, and generally made herself the most persistent headache in the life of every governor sent to Connaught. In 1576, Sir Henry Sidney, the Lord Deputy of Ireland himself, made a tour of the Western Province. He met Grace O'Malley. He was, despite himself, impressed. He described her in his official report as a most famous feminine sea captain. It was meant as a neutral observation. It reads, 4 centuries later, like an understatement of heroic proportions. But the English were patient, and they were relentless. In 1577, they caught up with her. Grace was captured. Some accounts say she was betrayed, others that she was ambushed during a raid on the Earl of Desmond's lands, and thrown into prison. First Limerick, in a cell that was cold and damp, even by Irish standards. Then she was transferred to the dungeons of Dublin Castle, where England kept its most dangerous Irish prisoners. Dublin Castle in the 1570s was not the tourist attraction it is today. It was a fortress, dark, filthy, and brutal. The dungeons sat below ground level, stone rooms with no windows, no light, no ventilation, where prisoners sat in their own filth and prayed for either release or death. The food was bread and water when it came at all. Disease was rampant. Many who entered those cells never left them alive. For 18 months, Grace O'Malley sat in that darkness. 18 months separated from her ships, her children, her sea, her sky. 18 months in a stone box, listening to the sounds of a city that was not hers, governed by laws she did not recognize, imprisoned by an authority she did not accept. For any other person, that might have been the end. The spirit broken, the will crushed, the body weakened beyond recovery. Grace O'Malley walked out of Dublin Castle, released most likely as part of a political deal between the English and the Connacht chieftains, and went straight back to piracy. Within months of her release, her galleys were raiding again. The English were appalled. They were also, one suspects, secretly awed. The next 15 years were a running battle, a war of attrition fought across the bays and headlands and island channels of the western coast. Grace raided. The English retaliated. Grace evaded, vanishing into the labyrinth of Clew Bay, where no English ship dared follow. The English burned her crops and seized her cattle. She raided their supply lines and captured their messengers. And through it all, one name appears again and again in the English state papers as Grace's chief antagonist: Sir Richard Bingham, the governor of Connacht. Bingham was a particular kind of Englishman, efficient, ruthless, incorruptible, and utterly convinced of the righteousness of his mission. He had fought in the Netherlands. He had helped crush the Spanish Armada survivors who washed up on the Irish coast in 1588. He regarded the Gaelic Irish as savages and treated them accordingly. He confiscated Grace's cattle and horses, thousands of head, the currency of wealth in the West. He installed an English garrison in Rockfleet Castle itself, seizing Grace's home and turning it into an outpost of the crown. He hunted her eldest son Owen, the child of her first marriage, and Owen was slain, murdered, Grace believed, on Bingham's orders, or at the very least, with his tacit approval. The composition of Connacht, a new English administrative framework imposed in 1585, stripped the Gaelic chieftains of their traditional rights and revenues. Grace's entire way of life, the tolls, the trade, the sea lordship, was declared illegal at the stroke of an English pen. And then, in 1593, Bingham played his final card. He arrested Grace's son, Tibbet Burke, Tibbet of the ships, the child born on the galley. He arrested her other surviving son, Murrough O'Flaherty, from her first marriage. He arrested her half-brother, Donal Napiopa, Donal of the Pipes, so called for his love of music. He charged them all with treason and conspiracy against the crown. And treason, under English law, meant death by hanging. Grace O'Malley was 63 years old. She had been fighting the English for 4 decades. She had been imprisoned, robbed, hunted, and betrayed. Her eldest son was dead. Her castles were garrisoned by English soldiers. Her fleet was diminished to a shadow of what it had been. And now the last of her family sat in chains in an English jail, waiting for the executioner. Most people, faced with such a catalogue of losses, would have surrendered. Or fled to Spain, where many Irish rebels found refuge. Or simply given up, retreated to some hillside farm and waited for death in silence. Grace O'Malley did something no one expected. She sat down and wrote a letter. Not to Bingham, not to the Lord Deputy of Ireland. She wrote directly to Queen Elizabeth I of England. She wrote to the most powerful woman in the known world and asked for a meeting. It was audacious. It was borderline insane. It was exactly the kind of thing Grace O'Malley would do. The letter reached London. It was delivered to the hands of William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, Elizabeth's Secretary of State and the most powerful bureaucrat in Europe. Burleigh was an old man by then, 73 years old, with gout and a lifetime of managing the Queen's enemies behind him. He had dealt with Mary Queen of Scots, with Philip of Spain, with plots and assassinations and armadas. But this letter from an Irish pirate queen intrigued him. Perhaps because it was so unexpected. Perhaps because it was so bold. Perhaps because Burleigh, who made his career by knowing things, sensed that this woman knew things about Ireland that his own officials did not. He sent back a document. It was formal, meticulous, and very Burleigh. It was called the Articles of Interrogatory, and it contained 18 questions. He wanted to know everything. Who was this woman? How old was she? Who was her father, her mother, her husband? How many times had she married? What was the nature of her enterprise? How had she lived since the death of her first husband? What ships did she command? What rights did women hold under Gaelic law? What was the custom of succession in Irish clans? How did the system of tanistry work? Burleigh was not merely vetting a petitioner, he was conducting an intelligence operation. Through the lens of one woman's life, he was trying to understand the entire Gaelic world that England was attempting to conquer. Grace answered all 18 questions. Her responses were shrewd, careful, and brilliantly calculated. She minimized her piracy. She presented herself not as a raider and a rebel, but as a wronged noblewoman, a loyal subject of the crown who had been driven to desperate measures by the tyranny of a corrupt governor. She described the seizure of her property. She detailed Bingham's cruelties. She explained the Gaelic customs of marriage and inheritance in terms that an English lawyer could understand and, crucially, sympathize with. She cast herself as a widow and a mother fighting for the survival of her family, which was true, as far as it went. It was also a masterpiece of political storytelling. She knew that Elizabeth, a woman who had fought her own battles for survival in a world dominated by men, would hear something familiar in her story. She was not just answering questions. She was building a case. She was telling the Queen a story. And the story worked. Despite Bingham's furious protests, he wrote letter after letter to London insisting that Grace was a traitor, a liar, and a dangerous rebel who would return to piracy the instant her family was free. Elizabeth agreed to see her. And so, in the early summer of 1593, Grace O'Malley gathered her most trusted crew, climbed aboard her galley, and set sail on the most dangerous voyage of her life. Not dangerous because of storms, though there were storms. Not dangerous because of enemy ships, though the English Channel was thick with warships. Dangerous because she was sailing into the heart of the empire that had been trying to destroy her for 40 years. And she was betting everything, her family, her freedom, her life, on a single conversation. The journey itself was extraordinary. Picture the route. South from Clew, past the towering cliffs of Moher, where the Atlantic funnels into a churning corridor of white water. Around the headlands of Kerry, where the Skellig rocks rise from the ocean like the spines of drowned cathedrals. East along the coast of Cork, past the harbor of Kinsale, where, 8 years later, the last great Irish rebellion would be crushed. Across the Celtic Sea, through the shipping lanes where English merchantmen and Spanish galleons and Breton fishing boats jostled for space. Past the cliffs of Cornwall, white and ancient. Through the Strait of Dover, narrow enough that you could see France on a clear day. And then, up the Thames, mile after mile of flat, brown, crowded water, the banks lined with wharves and warehouses and the tumbling tenements of a city that was the largest in Europe. For a woman who had spent her entire life on the wild Atlantic, where the horizon was empty and the nearest neighbor was a seal, London must have been overwhelming. The noise, the stench, the sheer crush of humanity, the towers of the great churches rising above the smoke, the palaces along the riverbank, the warships at anchor. She had sailed into the belly of the beast, and the beast was enormous. What happens next has become one of the most famous encounters in Irish history. And like all famous encounters, it has gathered legends around it, the way a hull gathers barnacles. But the core facts are documented in the English state papers, and they are remarkable enough without embellishment. Grace O'Malley was brought to Greenwich Palace, the Queen's favorite summer residence, a sprawling complex of courtyards and gardens on the south bank of the Thames, downstream from London. She was brought into the presence chamber. The court was assembled, the lords and ladies, the secretaries and guards, the ambassadors and hangers-on who made up the permanent human scenery of Elizabeth's court. The Queen sat on her throne, dressed in the magnificent, jewel-encrusted gowns for which she was famous. Her face painted white with ceruse, her red wig immaculate. She was 60 years old, still sharp, still formidable, still very much in command. And Grace walked in and did not bow. She did not curtsy, she did not kneel. She stood upright, a gray-haired pirate in a room full of silk, and met the Queen's eyes. Later accounts say she refused to kneel because she did not recognize Elizabeth as the Queen of Ireland. Ireland had its own kings and queens, its own laws, its own traditions, and Grace O'Malley did not accept that any foreign monarch had the authority to demand her submission. Whether this interpretation is historically precise or whether Grace was simply being Grace, the effect on the court would have been electric. No one refused to bow before Elizabeth. The penalty for such an insult could be imprisonment, or worse. The courtiers must have held their breath. Then there was the matter of the dagger. When Grace was searched before the audience, a standard precaution for anyone entering the royal presence, the guards found a blade concealed in her clothing. The courtiers were horrified. A weapon in the presence chamber was an act of treason. Assassinations were a constant fear in Elizabeth's court. But Grace explained, calmly and without apology, that she carried the dagger for personal protection. It was the custom of her country. She was a woman who had sailed alone through dangerous waters, and she would not be parted from her knife.
Elizabeth, to the astonishment of every person in the room, accepted the explanation and waved the matter aside. One suspects she recognized something in Grace's refusal to be disarmed. Elizabeth herself was never truly unarmed.
And then the sneeze. At some point during the meeting, the exact moment varies depending on who tells the story. Grace sneezed. A noblewoman of the court, following the etiquette of the English aristocracy, offered her a delicate lace handkerchief, finely embroidered, the kind of thing that costs more than an Irish farmer earned in a year. Grace took it, blew her nose vigorously, and threw the soiled cloth into the nearest fireplace. The court gasped. Lace was expensive. The gesture seemed barbaric, but Grace informed them, with the patience of a teacher explaining something obvious to a slow child, that in Ireland, a used handkerchief was considered unclean. One did not carry filth in one's pocket. One destroyed it. It was, depending on your perspective, either a genuine cultural misunderstanding or a deliberate provocation designed to remind every person in that room that she came from a different world with different rules, and she was not ashamed of it. Knowing Grace O'Malley, it was almost certainly both. But beneath these colorful stories, the unbowed head, the hidden blade, the burning handkerchief, lies the real substance of the meeting. Two women, both in their 60s, both rulers in their own right, both survivors of a world that had tried its best to destroy them. Elizabeth had survived the execution of her mother, imprisonment in the Tower, plots to assassinate her, the Spanish Armada, and the constant pressure of a court full of men who believed a woman could not rule. Grace had survived shipwreck, imprisonment, the death of 2 husbands, the murder of her son, the loss of her lands, and 40 years of war against the most powerful nation in Europe. They were, in a sense that transcended the vast differences in their circumstances, the same kind of creature. And they recognized it. They spoke in English, the only language they shared. Grace spoke no Latin, the language of diplomacy. Elizabeth spoke no Irish. And yet, by all accounts, they understood each other perfectly. Some reports suggest the conversation lasted for hours. Some say they spoke privately, without translators or courtiers, which was almost unheard of in Elizabeth's court. Whatever passed between them, the result was extraordinary. Grace laid out her case with the precision of a lawyer and the passion of a mother. Her sons and brother were imprisoned unjustly. Bingham was a tyrant who had exceeded his authority and used his position to enrich himself at the expense of loyal subjects. Her lands and property had been confiscated without legal process. Her cattle had been stolen. Her eldest son had been murdered. She wanted her surviving family freed, Bingham investigated and removed from power, and her rights and estates restored. In exchange, she offered to cease her rebellion against the crown and to use her fleet and her knowledge of the western coast against Elizabeth's enemies, specifically against the Spanish, who were using the west of Ireland as a staging ground for attacks on England. Elizabeth listened. She asked questions. She weighed the politics. And then she did something remarkable. She granted nearly every single request. By the end of September 1593, Elizabeth had written to Bingham ordering the release of Tibbet Burke and Donald na Piopa. She ordered that Grace be given maintenance from her son's estates so that she could live in dignity. She instructed that Bingham's conduct toward the O'Malley and Burke clans be investigated. She even addressed the matter of Grace's revenues, acknowledging that the pirate queen had a right to some form of income from her ancestral waters. On paper, it was a total victory. A pirate queen, an illiterate woman from the edge of the known world, had walked into the throne room of the most powerful monarch in Europe and walked out with everything she wanted. But here is where history gets complicated, because paper is patient and governors are not. Bingham did not simply obey. He delayed. He argued. He wrote letters back to London, page after page, insisting that Grace was a traitor, a liar, a dangerous rebel who would return to piracy the moment her family was free. He pointed out, correctly, that Grace had been raiding English ships for decades. He noted, also correctly, that her promises of loyalty were about as reliable as an Atlantic forecast in November. And he was not entirely wrong. Grace O'Malley was all of those things. She was also a mother fighting for her children's lives, a chieftain defending her people, and a woman who had been backed into a corner by forces she could not defeat by strength alone, and who had found another way. Eventually, under sustained pressure from London, Bingham released the prisoners. Grace got her family back. She did not, however, get peace. The last decade of her life was spent in an Ireland tearing itself apart. The 9 Years' War, the great rebellion led by Hugh O'Neill and Red Hugh O'Donnell, raged across Ulster and spilled into Connacht. English armies burned their way through the countryside. Irish chieftains who had held their lands for centuries were driven out, killed, or forced into submission. The old Gaelic order, the system of clans and chieftains, of Brehon law and tanistry, of Irish language and Irish custom that had governed Ireland for 1,000 years and more, was crumbling. Grace watched it fall. She was too old to fight by then, her fleet reduced, her body failing. But she was too stubborn to submit. She remained at Rockfleet, grey stone against grey sky, watching the world she had known dissolve around her. Her son Tibbet, the one she had sailed to London to save, the child born on a galley in the middle of the Atlantic, proved to be a survivor of a different kind. He made his peace with the English. He calculated the odds, as his mother had always taught him to calculate odds, and he concluded that the old Gaelic world was finished. He submitted to the crown. He received an English title, the first Viscount Mayo. He fought for the English in the 9 Years' War and in subsequent conflicts. He adopted English customs, English law, English dress. Some would call this betrayal, a son turning his back on everything his mother had fought for. Others would call it the only rational response to an unstoppable force, the ultimate pragmatism of a man raised by a pirate. Grace, who had spent her entire life resisting the force that her son now served, must have had complicated feelings about his choice. But she had given him his life. She had sailed to London and bargained with a queen to keep him alive. What he did with that life was his own affair. The debt was paid. Grace O'Malley died in 1603. The exact date is not recorded because the English did not record the deaths of Irish women, even famous ones. She was approximately 73 years old. She died, most historians believe, at Rockfleet Castle, the tower house she had won through marriage and kept through sheer force of will. The fortress that had withstood English sieges and Atlantic storms and the passage of decades. She was buried, according to tradition, in the Cistercian Abbey on Clare Island, the same island where she had based her fleet, the same abbey where she had worshipped, the same stone church that looks out over Clew Bay toward the mountains of Mayo. The sea surrounded her in death as it had surrounded her in life. And here is the detail that lifts this story from history into something close to poetry. Elizabeth I of England also died in 1603. On the 24th of March, in Richmond Palace, the Virgin Queen drew her last breath. She was 69 years old. She had outlived her enemies, her lovers, her rivals, and most of her friends. She left no heir. Her dynasty died with her. Two queens, two women who had fought for power in a world designed to deny them any. Two women who had met, spoken, negotiated, and reached an agreement across a gulf of language, culture, geography, and politics so vast that it should have been unbridgeable. They entered the world decades apart, on opposite sides of an ocean of difference. They left it in the same year, within months of each other, as if the universe itself had recognized that their stories were, in some fundamental way, the same story. But the world did not remember them equally. Elizabeth became one of the most famous monarchs in history. Her name is in every textbook on every continent. Her face hangs in every major gallery in Europe. Her reign is called the Golden Age. Shakespeare, Drake, the Armada, Raleigh, Spencer, the defeat of the Spanish and the foundation of the British Empire. Everyone knows Elizabeth. She is inescapable. Grace O'Malley became a footnote, a folk song sung in pubs along the west coast of Ireland when the whiskey was flowing and the tourists had gone home. A legend told by old men to children who half believed it. For centuries after her death, she was virtually unknown outside of Connacht. No portraits survive, no personal letters beyond her answers to Burghley's interrogatories, no diary, no memoir, no account written in her own hand. The 18 answers she gave to Lord Burghley's 18 questions are among the only words we have in her own voice. Everything else is secondhand, filtered through the reports of English officials who called her a pirate, a rebel, a notorious and dangerous woman, as if those were insults and not the highest possible compliments a person could receive. The silence lasted 400 years, but the story refused to die. It survived in songs and poems passed down in the Irish language. It survived in the place names of Mayo and Galway, Hinscastle, Rockfleet, Clare Island, Granuaile's Tower. It survived in the stubborn memory of a people who had been conquered but not erased. And then, slowly, the world began to pay attention. In 1979, Anne Chambers, a historian from County Mayo, published the first serious biography of Grace O'Malley. It was called Granuaile, Ireland's Pirate Queen, and it was a revelation. Chambers dug through the English state papers, the same papers that had dismissed Grace as a pirate and a nuisance, and she reconstructed a life of staggering scope and courage. The book changed everything. It brought Grace O'Malley out of the pubs and the folk songs and into the light of serious history. In 1985, the Irish composer Sean Davey wrote Granuaile, a symphonic suite for voice, uilleann pipes, and orchestra, performed by the singer Rita Connolly. It was haunting, beautiful, and defiant, and it became a classic of Irish music. One of its pieces, Ripples in the Rock Pools, entered the Irish school curriculum, ensuring that generations of children would hear Grace's name in a classroom and not just in a pub. In 2007, the story reached Broadway. The Pirate Queen, a musical by Alain Boublil and Claude-Michel Schoenberg, the team behind Les Miserables, opened in New York with Stephanie J. Block as Grace and Linda Balgord as Elizabeth. The critics were unkind, and the show closed after 85 performances. But the mere fact that it existed, that two of the most successful musical theater composers in the world had looked at the sweep of human history and chosen this woman's story to tell, says something about the power of Grace O'Malley's life. Some stories are too big for a single production, too wild for a stage. A bronze statue stands today in the grounds of Westport House in County Mayo. It shows Grace as she must have looked in her prime, fierce, windblown, looking out toward the sea. Westport House itself contains an exhibition on her life, compiled by Anne Chambers, visited by thousands every year. Her story is taught in Irish schools. She has become a symbol of resistance, of female power, of the refusal to accept that anyone, man, king, governor, or empire, has the right to tell you where you can and cannot go. But here is what stays with me. Not the battles, not the piracy, not even the extraordinary meeting at Greenwich Palace, though all of those things are remarkable. What stays with me is simpler than that. Two women sat in a room in Greenwich Palace in September of 1593. One ruled an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the shores of the New World. The other ruled a coastline of rock and rain and treacherous water. One had armies and navies and the wealth of a continent. The other had 3 galleys and the loyalty of her crew. One wore silk and pearls and a crown encrusted with diamonds. The other carried a hidden dagger and threw handkerchiefs into the fire. And when they spoke as equals. Not because the world saw them as equals. The world saw one as a queen and the other as a criminal. But they saw themselves as equals. And in that room, at that moment, between those 2 women, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The sea off Clare Island still pounds the cliffs the way it did 500 years ago. The Atlantic does not care about empires or their collapse. Rockfleet Castle still stands at the head of its inlet, gray stone against gray sky, watching over Clew Bay with the patience of something that has been waiting a very long time and is not yet done. The tidal channels are still treacherous. The winds still come in hard from the west, carrying rain and salt and the smell of open ocean. If you stand on the battlements of Rockfleet on a winter evening when the light is failing and the clouds are low and the bay is empty of everything except water and stone and wind, you can almost hear it. The creak of oars in their locks, the snap of a square sail catching the gale, the shout of a lookout sighting prey, and underneath it all, the voice of a bald girl who was told she could not sail and sailed anyway, who was told she could not fight and fought anyway, who was told she could not rule and ruled anyway, who was told she could not win and won anyway, in the only way that truly matters, by refusing, to her last breath, to be anyone other than exactly who she was. And that is the true story of Grace O'Malley, Granuaile, the pirate queen of Connacht, the woman who looked an empire in the eye and did not blink. Subscribe to Tales of the High Seas. Otherwise, Grace O'Malley's ghost will sail up your nearest river, board your house through the bathroom window, and charge you a harbor toll on every cup of tea you drink for the rest of your natural life. She has been waiting 400 years for back payments. Interest has been accruing at the standard O'Malley rate, which is everything you own plus your boat. Do not test her patience.